We're talking today all about finances, which normally I don't get very excited about, but I'm very excited today. We're thrilled to welcome Erik Pervin to our show today. He's a bookkeeper with Greenbooks, and of course, the one and only Kristina Inrig is going to be here as well. But before we get to that, I have to introduce my friend Natushka. Hi, Natushka.
Hi, Sam. How are you doing?
Good. Look at that beautiful smile. Natushka's going to tell us all about CBI. So I'm going to be right back with you with Erik and Kristina. We'll dive right into finances, but I'm handing it over to you, Natushka. Away you go.
Thank you, Sam. Hi, everyone. My name is Natushka Michelle Flay, and I am the Outreach Coordinator for CBI. Let me introduce and talk to you about CBI. So CBI stands for Capacity Building Institute. So we provide training, coaching, and mentorship support to staff and volunteers in the environmental nonprofit sector across all Canada. Oops. So we aim to foster leadership within the environmental sector by providing training, coaching, mentorship at all stages, from executive directors to board members, fundraisers, and other staff. Our mission is to train 10,000 leaders of small shops, not-profit environmental organization in Canada within the 10 next year. We believe that Canada environment deserves all the help it can get from well-running nonprofits organization, from donors, and from well-trained staff and board members. We also believe that environmental nonprofits play a vital role in the ongoing efforts to ensure a healthy and sustainable future for all Canadians. That training matters. It helps keep our organization well-staffed, fully compliant with laws and regulation, and effective in their game-changing work. We also believe that Canada environment deserves all the help it can get from a nonprofit organization, from donors. I think that I said that, didn't I? Yes, sorry. There we go. That small shop organization makes a big difference. It had diversity, dynamics, grassroots involvement in Canada environmental sector. And we at last that there is much more to do in a strong and more resilient environmental sector within our reach. And we have the courage and commitment to build it all together. What do we offer? First of all, Capacity Building Certificate Program, which we call CBCP, Internship Training Program, Fundraising Intensive Workshop, Capacity Building Webinar Series, and Leadership Training Stream. For the CBCP, it will start in June. For those who had missed the due date, who was May 5th, you could send me an email and we will be able to talk about it and try to our best to see if you can reach the CBCP program. We have also in the BCBC program the 6 core models that you could see there. And we even have a testimonial from Rochelle Byrne, who actually did do the CBCP program. We have great leaders like Sam, who's with us today, Rob Burns, Barb, and Alex, who's going to be joining for the CBCP program. Today's sponsors is Greenbooks Financial Services, which will be talk with Kristina and Erik. Greenbooks has been established in 2015. It's a fully serviced bookkeeping social enterprise founded to help other environmental nonprofits. Their goal is to help you deliver on your mission without wasting time, worries about the book. They believe that high quality bookkeeping should be accessible to organizations of any size and strive to provide excellences and value. They're specialized in QuickBooks, bookkeeping, and financial consultant. By organizing the books and helping organizations meet their legal financial obligation, Greenbooks remove the stress of doing it yourself. Bookkeeping that many small shops experience, thereby allow them to specialize their remaining resources of the core purposes. If you have any more question about it, you could contact Chantel, who's the executive director of Greenbooks. Don't forget to save the next webinar, who will be Monday, June 5th at 4:00 Eastern. And you could register at capacitybuilding.ca events. If you have any question or anything, you could email infos@capacitybuilding.ca. Anna or I, Natushka Michelle, and or you could write to us at the Sustainable Capacity Solution Office. Thank you very much. Back to you, Sam.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it, Natushka. Great information there about CBI. If you haven't been to one of our webinars before, welcome. We have a really good opportunity to dive into those subjects that maybe are on your mind today. Finances are on everyone's mind, so thank you so much for being here today. I'd like to introduce, first of all, Erik Pervin. Erik is with Greenbooks. Hi, Erik. Fantastic. We're going to be talking about all sorts of subjects today, including payroll and taxes. We're going to bust some myths today as well. And I can't think of anyone else we'd rather do it with than Kristina Inrig. Hi, Kristina.
Hey, Sam. Great to be here.
Kristina, of course, is, well, you're everywhere, Kristina. Kristina is the CEO of the Sustainable Capacity Foundation, and she really is everywhere. I don't know how she does it. Today is really an opportunity to take a deep dive into finances, and sometimes, Erik, this can be an area that causes a lot of stress for anyone working in nonprofit. But there are some, some best practices that we can share today. We want to take the stress out of finances, don't we, Erik?
Absolutely, Sam. That's what we're all about.
That's what you're all about. So give us a sense. What do you think is the sort of the biggest piece of advice you would give somebody that's working in a small nonprofit that feels like they're wearing lots of different hats? What's the best advice you would give in terms of the financial picture?
Yeah, wow, Sam, that's really coming out the gate with the key question that everyone wants to know, right? Of course, part of the answer is it depends. If you don't have the luxury of being able to work with a bookkeeper or have a really engaged treasurer, if you're feeling lonely, if everything's resting on your shoulders, the best thing that I can say is to really make an effort to carve out a chunk of time, maybe it's 30 minutes once a week, that you just deal with sort of the little financial things. Because the biggest problem that I have encountered is that each little issue doesn't feel like a big problem, because in isolation, it's a small task, it's filing one receipt, it's keeping one invoice, but these problems have a way of just sort of overwhelming us once there's so many of them, in particular, when you can't remember exactly what happened and all you have are scattered notes. So really just even 20 to 30 minutes a week can be a huge game changer to file that receipt, write a little memo about what actually happened, send that email. And that just helps you stay on top of things and keeps it fresh in your memory.
Mm-hmm. So it's not so different really than our own finances at home, Erik, really. It's just, to keep on top of it. And Kristina, when we think about the finance piece, we can think about not only obviously trying to pay people, but keeping track of donations and tax receipts, payroll. It really can become, like Erik said, overwhelming. Do you sort of compartmentalize them, Kristina? How do you manage all that?
Well, I think financial management stress is sort of the dirty little secret of executive directors that we don't like to talk about in the sector. Certainly for me, when I started my first gig as an executive director of an environmental group back in, I think it was 2005 with Tucker House, I didn't know anything about financial management. That's not why I chose to come to this small shop organization. I was interested in the sustainability programs. I wanted to get out in the woods. I wanted to work with kids on creating a sustainable future. I didn't know or want to know about money management, but I learned pretty quickly that as an ED, and at the time as the only employee of the organization, that I really had to learn about finances. And so even though we may come to this from different perspectives in the work we do, whether as board members of a nonprofit or as staff, or even with a semi-larger team, someone has to keep an eye on the finances of the organization. And it's one of the things that can slip through the cracks. And I think what Erik is saying speaks to me as well, because I'm just as guilty as everybody of kind of putting it off a little bit too long and then having to try to remember what exactly was that receipt about or that transfer about. So I think it is something that, we just wanted to open the doors to today and talk about honestly, because this is not a new problem. This was a problem for me when I started my career in the sector, and it's still a problem today. We hear from groups all the time through the social enterprise Greenbooks of how they're just panicked. They just can't manage the financial part and everything's piling up. And in some cases has been piling up for years. And it's sort of like we don't want to admit that this is a burden on our sector. So we need to have some clear ways to address it and to solve these problems.
Mm-hmm. And there are certain deadlines, right? I mean, CRA is obviously kind of keeping us on track in many ways. We know we need to file certain documentations with CRA. As well. So those kind of sort of deadlines and an AGM and audited financial statements, all of those things, Erik, are so key. How can we actually use them to benefit us as opposed to thinking, oh my heavens, I have to fill that form out?
Yeah, that is a good question. Like, how do you incentivize people to get excited about an AGM, right? Yeah. Or the audit? It's a tricky one, and I find sometimes the easiest way is to work backwards from some of the consequences that you want to avoid, and you can sort of just remind people that if this, then we might have a risk of that. If we don't do this, then we could run into trouble down the road. And the best way to keep on top of that is to just plug the dates into your calendar. It's really easy. Set a reminder 2 months out, because I find these things always take a little bit longer than you think. You have to send emails, find dates, coordinate. Everything takes a little longer. So I always give myself twice as much time as I think I need to get something sorted out. And then usually I'm just, on time. I think that the other piece is that you can appeal to the sense of calm that folks can feel when things are under control. Mm-hmm. You can, get something done and remind people later, wasn't it great after the audit was complete? What a breath, a sigh of relief that we could all have. And so you can kind of take a two-pronged approach, both of saying, we have to do this because we risk our nonprofit status, we risk our charitable status, whatever, the kind of the stick approach, if you will, the fear of the consequence. But I find where possible, I like to encourage people with the positive, the sort of carrot, if you will, of it's just going to feel good when this is done. It'll be nice, right? It'll be off your plate. And as we kind of say quite often, it just allows you to really direct all that emotional and intellectual energy to your mission. Which is again kind of, I think, echoes what Kristina was saying, that she came to become an executive director for everything other than the financial management of a medium or small shop organization. So I think that's the other piece too, is reminding people, hey, we get this done, and then great, we get to go deliver programs, talk to donors, whatever it is that sort of fires you up.
And I think when we take that view of it not being punitive, like even from an audit perspective, right? That sometimes, Kristina, we think about the audit, auditors are asking for backup on something and you can feel defensive about it. But the reality is we're not alone. Every other nonprofit and charity in this country is going through the same thing. And in reality, it's actually something that keeps us safe, Kristina. It's actually a very positive thing, but I think our mind has to be put there, right?
Yeah, well, there's a couple things I would say about that. And the first one is, figure out what exactly your organization needs to do, because we're not all created equal in this sector. And there are different rules for different organizations. And so that sense of calm, or, feeling like what's on your plate will be helped by making sure you're doing the right steps, as opposed to just kind of looking around and saying, what's everybody else doing? So first of all, I would encourage you to make sure you know what type of incorporated entity you are, because that's going to drive some of the financial reporting and decisions you need to do. So for example, if you're federally incorporated as a national organization through the Canada Not-for-Profit Act, you're going to have different financial requirements than if you're provincially incorporated. And then which province you're in is going to also weigh in terms of what rules you have. So here's a concrete example. If you're federally incorporated through Industry Canada, Corporations Canada, then if you're over 50,000 a year in revenue, then you need to take some step in order to get your financials reviewed by an external party. If you're incorporated in Ontario and you're over $100,000, that's the threshold with which you have to bring in someone outside, whether it's an accountant for an audit or not. And then the level of audit you would require will also depend on your size. So I just wanted to be careful that we're not talking in blanket terms, because it is very individual depending on your organization. The first thing to know is whether you're federally incorporated or provincially incorporated. The second thing to know is whether you're a registered charity or not. And depending on that, what you have to file to which government department is going to vary. So there's a lot of differences. But the other key thing you want to think about is, when is your financial year end? Because once you know your year end, that will trigger a bunch of other things that need to happen. So in terms of like 6 months down the road from your year end, that's when things start becoming due to the government. Mm-hmm. And so knowing that, like, it's funny, even sometimes I forget what's the year end of this group, always having to remember that in order to plan out the financial pieces that might be due. But going back to what you were just saying there, Sam, in terms of auditors, my other little secret is that all auditors are different, and it's not always black and white. I always stress to my teams that there are gray areas when it comes to an audit. And I would say in the last couple of years, audits, if you're doing a full audit, which by the way, many of us do not need to do, we could just do a lower level of an engagement, not a full audit. But if you are doing a full audit, it is starting to take more time. And there are a lot more of those questions that you're talking about, Sam. And it does start to feel a little bit like you're under attack trying to pull all this together. So just absolutely remain calm. And the questionnaire that your auditor will send you, sometimes just feels so overwhelming, but, there are kind of, the audit rules have changed, and they are starting to ramp up audit requirements. And also they're starting to take longer to do audits. So I just want to flag those few things for folks who are about to go into an audit process.
Really helpful for sure. And when we think, Erik, about all of the different resources that, if somebody, to your point earlier, doesn't have, the luxury of having a bookkeeper themselves, there's lots of different resources there for us. Lead us there. Where are we going, Erik?
Yeah. I mean, of course, today is your first option, right? Attending this webinar is a great start. And if it doesn't answer all your questions, it hopefully it just gives you, a sense of what questions you should be asking. Like what Kristina just said is tremendously helpful. And it took me some time to wrap my head around that when I was first starting in the nonprofit sector, to understand the different kinds of entities. I've actually had I know not everyone loves the sound of this, but I've had tremendous success just calling the CRA and asking them.
Me too.
They are lovely people most of the time. Not always, but that's like anything, right? You might get somebody who's having a bad day. But the number of good conversations that I've had with folks from the CRA, it greatly outweighs the disgruntled sort of, standoffish, cold experiences that, happen once in a while. So the CRA is a great resource. And I know that that's like still a very large entity, right? So I can break it down, make it a little more specific, particularly when I'm calling about things like, or I'm wondering about my corporate taxes, for example, or anything about the T2 annual returns. Generally, I'm going to call the business inquiries line, and that's the specific phone number. And maybe I can dig it up and drop it in the chat a little later on. But the business inquiries line is tremendously helpful. If I'm calling about HST, so some groups may be registered for HST, then there's actually a different phone number, and that's called HST Rulings. And they've been really helpful for me to understand and break down sort of technical questions. Should I be charging HST on this? If so, or if not, is it GST, or which province is it coming from? They can really help with those things. So I find going to the source is so helpful. And I know a lot of people are intimidated by that because they think, oh, I'm not an accountant. I don't know, I don't have the right vocabulary. I'm not sure. I don't want to seem like irresponsible. Or some people even worry that I've heard this, that, they worry that by calling the CRA, it's going to like flag them in some way. And then, so they like use a fake name or something, and it's like, they're not, it's not true. You just calling them is really helpful. And what their job is, though, just to be clear, their role, whether you're calling about HST or your tax return or your financial statements, anything like that, their job is to interpret legislation. So they will help explain the legislation to you in layman's terms in a way that will help you understand it. They're unfortunately not able to always answer every single question you have, because there's sort of a point at which they become more in a consulting role, like you're just asking them to sort of make a decision for you. So sometimes there's a limit, and they'll sort of say, I can't actually answer this. This is your decision, but like, here's what the legislation says. And I found that tremendously helpful, because then we can go to the board, to the team, whomever that may be, and we can say, okay, well, this is exactly what we're required to do. Here's sort of our options. And it gives you that confidence to know that, okay, this is the, it narrows the horizons to say, okay, we have a few options here, X, Y, or Z. And if we're going to pick option X, then this is what we have to do. And it kind of gives you a little bit of a path forward.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm just going to jump in there and agree with Erik that CRA is definitely not a scary monster that we need to be afraid of to talk to. But also, you should remember that CRA does work a little bit in silos. So, and those silos don't necessarily talk to each other. So just like Erik said, if you want to talk about HST, you're calling the HST department. If you want to talk about the charity related stuff, tax receipting, things related to your charity, you're calling the charities directorate. And if you're talking about, your T2 return, you're talking to the business section. And same with payroll and deductions. That's a whole separate section. And the other thing I would say, and maybe someday they'll upgrade their system, but those silos don't necessarily talk to each other. So if you change your address with Charities Directorate, you may also need to call HST and change your address with them. And I have found at times I've had to call each of the different CRA departments to try to keep things straight, depending on what it is I'm talking about. But yes, I definitely have done exactly that thing, called CRA. Unfortunately, you often can't get an answer in writing. Like they won't document for you in writing in an email or a fax or anything what they say, but they will tell you over the phone some stuff and you can document it. But what I have found about CRA is that they're always extremely reasonable and forgiving. So if you say, well, I didn't realize I had to do that, and they usually will give you time to correct yourself. The only thing I would say 100% to never be late on is your T3010. If you're a charity and you need to file a T3010, which if you're a charity, you do, it's always due 6 months after your year end. And you should absolutely not be late on that, because there have been cases where groups have started to get their charitable status revoked for submitting those T3010s late. So generally speaking, CRA is very forgiving and gives you time to work on something if you're struggling. But I would say that's one area where you absolutely don't want to be late for, and get it in on time.
Great tip there for sure. Erik was mentioning boards, Kristina, and I just want to talk a little bit about finances and boards. What should we be sharing with our board? How often? What's the role there in your mind?
Yeah, the board has a fiduciary responsibility to the organization to keep an eye on the finances overall. I think we had a webinar on board related topics a few months ago, and I had shared, we were talking about the role of the treasurer. And I was saying that I think boards should have a look at the finances of their organization about quarterly. I think often looking at it monthly is too often for a small shop, because you need that time to see, things change and to have time to pull those reports together. So I would recommend that you have a quarterly review of the finances. And frankly, most boards as a whole don't spend time looking over the tax return and that kind of thing. That's usually, left to a finance committee or just to the ED if you have one, to take care of that. But as a board, it's important for you to know, what are your deadlines? What are the deadlines for filing? What thing you have to file with CRA, whether it's your T2, as Erik mentioned, or your T3010 if you're a charity. So just to throw that out there, you always have to file something with CRA. If you're a charity, it's your T3010 and it's due 6 months after your year end. If you're a nonprofit, it's your T2, which might be the long form or the short form version, and it's also due 6 months after your year end. So just make sure you know what that date is. We just had a whole bunch of groups close their year ends in March. That means we're working on their tax returns for the end of September when they'll be due. And I would just say, you need to know as a board what those deadlines are, and always make sure that those reports are going in. Not that you have to sit there and look through them all, but that you can get a confirmation that the submission was made to the government on time.
For sure.
And Sam, could I add something to that?
Of course, yes. Of
Yeah,
course.
I just wanted to kind of build on what Kristina's saying a little bit, because we're talking a lot about deadlines, putting them in the calendar, right? And sort of how not to forget and to plan. But I think something that's really important that your question gets at too is how do you get the buy-in at the board level to actually, care? I mean, of course they care, right? But are they really engaged in it on a sort of regular basis? It's one thing to have, a date in the calendar. It's another thing to have people looking ahead, seeing the date, and then thinking and planning. And I find sometimes one of the largest barriers to board engagement is sort of a lack of familiarity or comfort with the subject. Nobody wants to be embarrassed or look like they don't know what they're talking about. Finances sometimes attract a kind of somewhat intense or maybe attitude sometimes, or I don't know what it is, but for some reason there seems to be people who love it and then other people who seem to be a little bit afraid of it. So one thing that I think we can circulate is I've found this really good guide that's put out by CPA Canada, so Chartered Professional Accountants of Canada, and it's called, I think the title is Understanding Financial Statements for Your Board, and it's written, the audience is the board, and what it does is it sort of helps board members know and gives examples of what kinds of questions should I be asking about financial statements. How do I read a financial statement? Okay, I obviously can see the numbers, but what do they mean? And what would be a red flag? How do I know what to ask, what not to ask? And it's sort of 30 pages and then another 30, sort of that's the main document. It's not too long. And then there's another 30 pages of sort of further examples and references. So it's pretty short. It's a really good read. And I've read it just, multiple times just because it helps me, gives me good examples to explain to clients and just helps me sort of, explain concepts really clearly. So that's a great resource. It's very concise, and I can happily share that.
Yeah, that's one of the tools we use in the capacity building certificate program in the financial management section, for sure. But just going back to what Erik said, it's always funny when you start doing financial conversations at your board meeting, because you can tell the people that are excited to dig in, and then there are the people who kind of look away a little bit or try not to catch your eye, or they see a sheet of numbers in front of them and their eyes glaze over and they aren't really sure what they're looking at. So I think the first thing you can do as a board is just make sure there's a general comfort level in understanding what it is you're presenting. And so even for me as an executive director, I've learned to change how I bring the financial statements to the board. Sometimes, even though you can do all these fancy reports now out of QuickBooks that show comparisons and percentage changes and dollar changes, sometimes just the sheer amount of stuff on a page is too much. So I always try to collapse a number of fields and make it not simplified or dumbed down, just, so that you're not looking at such an overwhelming amount of information. You're summarizing the important things that you want to show. And then also, just if you're doing board development and helping to strengthen board member knowledge and capacity, one of the things you can do is a workshop on how do you actually read the financial statements and understanding, what is the balance sheet in relation to the operating statement, and how do those two work together and what you're explaining. And so I always try to do a little bit of an intro when I'm presenting financials to say, like, here's what we're looking at, here's the financials that we're digging into, and here's why things are a certain way. But if you notice that there's a lack of capacity on your board in that area, certainly, that's something you can develop and strengthen.
Absolutely. Beautifully said. Erik, let me ask you, when it comes to payroll, can we talk a little bit about payroll and, making sure that for your employees, that you're making the deductibles are right and they're not going to be in any sort of bundle when it comes to tax time as well? Walk us through some of the, I don't want to call them tips and tricks, but the strategies around payroll.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Sam. Payroll is, like, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It is a complicated, it's a complicated thing to get right. It like Kristina was mentioning earlier, it's different in every province, unfortunately. And there are, well, it's tremendously important for lots of reasons, right? Like your employees depend on the payroll to be able to pay their bills and to, for their livelihood. So you have this strong moral obligation to ensure that it's done correctly. And I feel that the federal government sort of punishes you when you make mistakes, right? Somewhat severely, because the penalties and interest and things can be relatively high on, for example, source deductions. So the mandatory deductions we take off of paychecks, like federal income tax, provincial income tax, CPP and EI, and then QPIP, as it's called in Quebec. All those things need to be remitted to the government on a very particular schedule. So, I'm not trying to overwhelm anybody with the complexity. I imagine anyone who has employees is aware of this. So some of the things that I like to do is if possible, using a payroll service is, I would suggest a really important thing to consider. They streamline pretty much everything for you. And if you pick the right one, they will also give you some support, some help. You can call them and you can say, I don't really know how to handle this situation. And they might even be able to advise you a little bit on, okay, here's to do some back pay, or you missed somebody's thing, you overpaid, you underpaid, fixing those little things. They might be able to advise on that. And that's huge. That is really, really big. Doing it all manually, and then submitting the source deductions on your own is a process that I think a lot of small shops are familiar with, but it's error prone. It's stressful. It's a decent amount of work because you have to do it every single month generally. So I think that's one option, is to shop around and look for payroll service providers. There's lots around, and we could put a few in the chat if people don't even know where to start. And then there is another option that I could offer, which is the National Payroll Institute is a Canadian organization, and they are sort of like the payroll organization. They have a professional designation for payroll providers, payroll practitioners, and they are advocates trying to help create good legislation around payroll. And they have a membership. And when you join, and I'm not affiliated with them, but I am a member, because when you join, you get access to their info line, and you have payroll professionals, like some of the best in the country. And you can just call them, and it's sort of like a secret members only hotline where they will just answer your questions. And I don't know exactly how much membership is, but it's maybe $30 or something for the year. Like, it's not maybe it's under $100 for sure. And that info line is also a really good resource that I don't think a lot of people know about. And as long as one person in your organization is a member, then you should be able to access that info line.
Wow, that's so smart. I didn't know any of that. That's brilliant. One of the tips that was shared with me when I became incorporated, and I think it works for EDs of small shops too, is a tool called Dext. where you can take a picture of any receipt, and then it helps categorize it. So if I'm out for lunch with somebody and it was a client, I can put, their name on the receipt and I take a picture of it, and then it's sent right to my accountant, which is very, very helpful as well. And I also use Mile IQ, which keeps track of all of my my mileage, because Lord knows I wouldn't without that. I need to though. Kristina, can we talk a little bit about tax receipts? It really is such an important part of what we do if we're issuing those tax receipts, if we're a charity. Talk to me a little bit about the tax piece.
Yeah, maybe since we've been talking a little bit about important dates and deadlines today, and I've already mentioned that 6 months after your fiscal year end is an important date for you from a financial perspective, but also in the calendar year, an important month for you is February. And that's both from a tax receipt point of view and also from a payroll point of view that Erik was just talking about. So February is when you have to issue all of your T4s to your employees, and then also submit your T4 summary to the federal government. So it's an important for payroll, but from a tax receipting point of view, it's also important because you want to issue all your tax receipts for the previous calendar year by the end of February each year. So yes, every time a donation is received, of course, this is just for registered charities, tax receipts do need to be issued, and you can either issue them as you go throughout the year, issuing them quickly, as I know, Sam, you always suggest people should be doing. But if you haven't been doing that, you need to make sure they're issued by February of each year. And then you need to keep a copy of them so that you can report on those when you file. So tax receipting is really important, but also keeping a copy and keeping records of any of those gifts that were received is important as well.
Absolutely brilliant. And Erik, when we think about any of the myths that we can bust, we've talked about all different aspects of financing today. Is there any myths that you can think of that you want to sort of say, what, that's not how this is done, or there's another way of doing this? Is there anything that comes to mind for you?
It's a good question. Before I answer that though, I just wanted to add a small thing on Kristina's comment around T4s. And this is sometimes a point of confusion, is that the deadline for the T4s has nothing to do with your fiscal year end. And that's the same with the tax receipts. That's sometimes a point of sort of confusion because people think, well, this is my year end, so all my forms, all my stuff has to be done, within 2 months or 6 months or what have you. But the T4s are a little different in that they follow the calendar year. And so it doesn't matter when your fiscal year is. They're January to December, and then by the end of February, they need to be done. So that's just a nice little sort of clarification. Onto the myths. I think the greatest myth probably in the nonprofit sector is that it's sort of like the myth of poor funding, or the myth of operating or overhead. Like what is overhead, right? As this sort of like vague concept. And we all know that, most funders sort of don't want to pay for overhead, right? And sometimes that means your rent or something like that. And sometimes it means some staff members potentially, or the executive director is often one of the positions that's hardest to fund. And I know I might be preaching to the choir a little bit here, but the nice thing is we are starting to see this change a bit. But what I would recommend to people is to think, when you're applying to a grant or you're getting funding, to just think critically about how you would sort of define overhead and what counts as a program expense versus an overhead expense. That's oftentimes the two big categories. We have program costs and revenues and expenses that are program related, which funders want to often pay for. And then you have the sort of admin or overhead bucket, which usually has a restriction. You can only spend this percent, or in some cases they give you nothing for that. So I think a really valuable tool is to just not sell yourself short, and to recognize that a portion of the ED's time, the executive director's time, is running program. So a part of their time is a program expense, because the program doesn't happen without them. The same thing if you have to host a physical space, and that space is part of your programs. then it's not overhead, right? That this is a core part of your program to facilitate this work in this space. So just sort of thinking about that and making the case to your funders and essentially convincing them through applications, through the way that you write your grants, that a certain amount of this person's time is legitimately considered a program expense. And I think that helps to break down this sort of odd myth that nonprofits sort of just run off of air, and sort of somehow the internet is paid. Everyone has laptops that have like a Zoom account and a Slack account and everything, all the other accounts, the MailChimp, all these things that we need to just operate, let alone payroll and whatever else you might have, like rent is huge expense. Like the idea that those things have nothing to do with the program is probably the biggest myth out there. So I just encourage folks, just to summarize, to advocate for yourself, to say, this is part of the program, we need this. And maybe it's not all of your rent because you only run programs in a portion of the time, but to think about including those when you're writing your funding applications.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Erik. Any myths you want to bust, my friend Kristina?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to build on what Erik said there. And when I, when we first started Greenbooks back in 2015, one of the first things that I did was help build a chart of accounts that really did a good job of separating out administrative versus program expenses. And every year I would do an adjustment to take only a small chunk of the executive director's salary and move it into admin, because the majority of what they are doing, especially with a small shop, is running the programs. So I definitely would echo what Erik is saying. And I think we should take a closer look at our own finances when we're differentiating between what is program and what is admin. Certainly now, as I work more in the philanthropic space, this message that Erik is saying about overhead is something that I try to emphasize when I'm meeting with other funders and working with them. I do think that we underestimate the cost and the need for administrative funding and resources in addition to our granting. And so that's something that I try to encourage with my own foundation and also encourage others to think about. But from a financial management point of view, I would say that having some kind of, I don't know if this is much of a myth, but as a tip, I would say having some kind of software to help you manage your finances is really important. It is hard to do it on your own, and it's hard to do it with Excel spreadsheets, which is, I think, the way that a lot of us were doing our bookkeeping and finances in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s. And certainly when I joined as an executive director of an organization that was only using Excel spreadsheets, that was a real problem and prone to a lot of error. And it's not to say that you don't get errors with QuickBooks and with other Simply Accounting, because people are still entering the information, so there can be lots of errors. But I feel like it is easier to catch them, and it's easier to kind of monitor a little bit better when it's not just an Excel spreadsheet. So I would really encourage people to think about that. If they need help with setting up those finances, there's lots of great bookkeepers and folks all across this country. And of course, Greenbooks is a great resource for you if you're a small shop in the environmental space and want to know more about it. But just setting yourself up correctly with a chart of accounts that really reflects what your organization is doing, and with some kind of accounting software that you can keep tabs on, and also do comparisons year over year. I think it's so valuable to be able to look at how the organization is changing and growing, and to be able to compare financially, like what are the different buckets of income that are coming in, and how do you compare sort of how your organization is either growing or shrinking or stabilizing. And that this idea around diversity of revenue and tracking that diversity is really important for our sector. So not all of our money is going to come from grants. There's all kinds of different ways that nonprofits bring money in. And so I think making sure we're tracking that and being able to compare year over year is going to be really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Kristina, brilliant. Anything else you want to share, Erik, to make our finance, jobs, whether it be our full-time pieces or whether you've got 1,000 other hats on, any other sort of tips or strategies you want to share with us?
I think the biggest thing that I like to emphasize, and thank you, Sam, for the question, because it's sometimes this doesn't come up, but the thing that I try to emphasize is that it's sort of more of a perspective or a philosophy in a way of like how to approach this topic than sort of a specific tip. But that, and this is something I think Kristina taught me is that good financial management is a good human resources policy, and that it helps your staff and all of your operations succeed. And I like to just, I have a sort of I've actually done a presentation sort of on that topic. And what it really comes down to is that when you prioritize to as much as possible, whatever that is, 20 to 30 minutes a week, like we talked about, or maybe it's a quarterly review with the board, a little bit of both maybe, that when you prioritize that, you're able to actually deliver on your mission so much better, and you're able to pay your employees on time if you have employees, or just be compliant with whatever the laws are. And that it's like, it's so easy, right, to just push it aside and to not worry about it. But when you do that, you kind of start to compromise the foundation of the organization. And what that tends to do is it tends to harm people, which is something that's really unfortunate. People get burnt out, they get overworked, stressed, and that's a huge problem in our sector, partly because we're generally sort of a passion-driven community. Like, a lot of people here are called to this work. It's vocational in some way. And so people care. And so they put in the effort, they put in the time. And as a manager, as an executive director, like, one of the ways that I think you can really show that you value your team and that you really care about them and that you care about their mental health and their work-life balance is to try to put in that, effort along the way, bit by bit, to keep the finances sort of organized. Because if something goes wrong and then people's pay is late, and all these things like that people can't live in that sort of uncertainty for years and years, right? Like, people will have to maybe leave the organization, and the cost of recruitment is sometimes 6 months to 12 months of whatever that person's salary was. So it's tremendously expensive. And I could go on, but really just thinking about this as kind of a human resources policy, if you will, or just as you're doing it to care for your team. I think that's the lens that I try to switch to, and it makes it really feel like, it makes me feel good about it, because I'm not like, oh, I'm just doing this because the CRA demands it, and I get kind of frustrated by that, and it feels like this big chore. But I'm like, no, I'm investing in my team. I'm supporting them. I'm providing value to my community by giving the people around this table that work with me and really care about this, a stable environment where they can thrive. And that's sort of like the lens that I try to encourage people to take. And it makes that 30 minutes each week more rewarding and not something that you're gonna put off. That's
a very big takeaway from me today, Erik, to be honest with you, because sometimes I can get a bit grumpy about it. I'll just be honest.
Me too.
Well, that makes me feel better. Kristina, I'll give a couple of seconds to you or a couple of minutes to you to sort of share any of the last minute thoughts, and then we'll open it up to questions as well. Anything that we haven't touched on that is kind of niggling at you in terms of financial management, Kristina?
Yeah, I have 3 tools that I want to talk about if you have a toolbox financially. But before I do that, I just want to echo Erik's point that he hinted at in terms of the instability in paychecks. And I see it a lot with small shops where they're like, it's okay, this person can wait an extra week to get their paycheck. And I really have a 0 tolerance policy for late paychecks. And I think as a sector, we need to really take care of our employees. Sometimes I'll push a bill if I have to, but for me, payroll needs to be made on time, even if there are grants coming in later and this and that. That's why I've helped to establish different cash flow loan programs and things like that, because I really feel that we have to pay our employees on time. It's like the one, very real contract and expectation that we need to keep up. So do whatever you can. Like I'll log in on my vacation and make sure that people get paid. Do whatever you can to make sure that your paychecks go out on time. and try not to make a culture where things are late all the time when it comes to your employees. But in terms of my toolbox, here are the 3 things that I think from a financial perspective that we should try to remember and use to our advantage. We talked about some of them already, but the first one is around your budget. We haven't talked much about that today, but having a budget for the organization is really valuable, and it's a tool that will help you throughout the whole year. Personally, I feel like budgets need to be made ahead of the fiscal year starting because it helps you to manage your year, having it in place. A budget needs to be approved by the board of directors. And if you're interested to learn more about budgeting, I've built this tool that is called Base and Expanded Budgeting, which I think can be really helpful for small organizations. So if you're interested to learn more about that, I encourage you to come out to the capacity building certificate program this year, because we do a whole series on the base and expanded budget. But having a budget, whatever form that takes, I think is your first tool. The next tool is around your financial statements. So we've talked about those from an annual perspective and knowing which type of financial statements you have. But just in general, using those financial statements regularly with your board as an executive director or a senior staff person, looking at those financials on a regular basis, and then comparing financials year over year to see how your organization is growing. It can be a really, really helpful tool when it comes to understanding. And it also is a great way to train and support, developing your staff for them to understand the finances and for them to get involved in financial management. So use those financial statements in a useful way. And that's a really important tool for your organization. And then the last piece is just around reporting, which we've talked about several times already. Know when your reports are due, whether it's things like your tax receipts or your T4 summary, but especially your tax return, whether it's a T3010 if you're a charity or a T2 if you're a nonprofit. Know your deadline, get it in there, and then make sure you're keeping track of those corporate memory as an organization and monitoring it year over year as well. So those are 3 kind of essentials for financial management for a nonprofit that I would suggest that we pay attention to and make sure we're keeping an eye on.
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. We've got a couple of minutes for questions. Feel free to pop them in the Q&A. And while we're waiting for any of those questions, why don't we just take a second, Kristina, and talk a little bit about the capacity building certificate program, which I am a big fan of, as you know, and I know it's been something that's been really important to you over the years as well. Give us a little sense of what's happening there, and we'll look for some questions here.
Sure. This is the 5th anniversary of the Capacity Building Certificate Program. So I'm really excited that we'll be running it again this year. It's a 6-month program, runs from June to November. And if you missed the deadline, as Natushka said at the beginning of the meeting, there is still time to get in. It's a self-guided program that you can do at your own time. That base and expanded budget tool that I mentioned is already in there. There's a video about it and some resources. But then there's also live sessions with myself and other key trainers. And we'll be featuring the 6 themes of the Capacity Building Certificate Program as part of our monthly webinars. So every month, Sam or I will help walk us through one of those 6 themes, and we'll be inviting all of the participants of the CBCP to attend. So really encourage you. It's only a commitment of sort of one afternoon a month at the time of these webinars and slightly before, where we're going to get together with the group. As I said, we've held it 5 years in a row, and it's really a boot camp for the things you need to know to run a small shop environmental organization. We talk about financial management, we talk about fundraising, we talk about boards, and most importantly, it's the peer support of working with your other folks who are in the sector. And we started these programs in Ottawa, and Erik can speak to it because he was at some of our early sessions that we held in Ottawa, and we held them in person. But since the pandemic and since Zoom has really picked up for us, we've started to hold them virtually so that everyone from across the country can get involved. And it's been really enriching to have those conversations with folks in Newfoundland, folks in BC, all across the country to talk about what they're facing as a small shop environmental organization. So number one, it's to make you feel less alone and to be able to talk about direct, real things that are happening in your organization. Is there a struggle on your board? Are you trying to diversify your funding base and having, to think through some of these issues, and you can bounce some of those ideas off your colleagues. Erik, I just wanted to give you a moment because you did take the program. If you had anything you want to add, not to put you too much on the spot, but
no, I was going to jump in and say I've got a testimonial. Yeah, in short, I think the best part for me was meeting other nonprofit leaders, and feeling this sense of community, and being able to just talk about like what they do and why. You know, we as a sector, you know, sometimes, you know, we have a lot of duplication, or we are kind of, you know, somebody else has figured something out, and we're new, and or you know, a new organization perhaps, and we haven't quite got the systems in place, the templates, you know, and one of the coolest things with the nonprofit sector, I find, that really differentiates it from other sort of industries, if you will, is that there's a culture of sharing that is quite amazing, quite remarkable. People are usually, once you get to know them a little bit, they'll send you their HR manual or something, and you can just, you know, use it as a model. They'll send you whatever it is that you might need help with. They might even have a document that you can, you know, not copy verbatim, but that you can get all the headers, and then you can put your language in, you know, whatever the case may be. Or they can just sit with you and think through a problem for half an hour. I still have friends and people that I met through that program, and we're still in touch, and we're still, you know, trying to make the world a better place together, each in our own way. So yeah, I can speak highly about it for sure.
Brilliant.
Yeah, and it is a pay what you can model this year. So although the value of the course is over $12,000, we have a fee of $67.80, but as Hannah mentioned in the chat, but it is pay what you can, and we are sponsoring people who can't afford that, because we know that many of us don't have a budget for training, and I've been working hard to get sponsors to come out. So so just wanted to let you know, don't make cost a reason not to do it, but sign up soon, because we're just going to be finalizing our participants for this year.
Wonderful. We have a couple of questions that are being answered, and which is wonderful. The references will be given in that are in the chat will be sent in a follow-up email. Thank you so much, Hannah, for that. Great connecting with everyone today. We even had someone here from New Zealand. How cool is that? It's wonderful to have time with all of you. Get ready for June. I will not be here, but don't you worry. Kristina Inrig will be here, and Natushka will be here, and Hannah will be here. Thank you so much to everyone. Great information. Kristina Inrig, thank you so much as always. And Erik Pervin, thank you so much for the great information. You can connect with either one of them. I know they'll answer your questions offline as well. It's been a pleasure to spend time with you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. See you next time.
Bye.